So I'm not a lawyer, and so the perspective that I'll give you is predominantly through the research that I've done as a professor and prior to that. And as well, I hope to give you some anecdotes from my experiences in talking to returned foreign fighters and former violent extremists of all ilks. But I want to start by saying that the study of terrorism and its responses really isn't new, even though it feels like this all kind of came to the head since 2001, since the 9/11 attacks. But in fact, the study of terrorism dates back to the 1970s. And that was a period when airline hijackings, kidnappings, and high-profile hostage takings emerged as one of the primary methods for terrorism, one of the most primary terrorist tactics. The 1970s is also known as the decade when terrorism hit the international stage, because prior to that, terrorist attacks tended to be more domestic. But the realisation that hijackings, airline hijackings, and these high-profile hostage takings and kidnappings could attract international media attention really heralded a new era in terrorism, and it really hasn't gone back from that since then. The phrase propaganda by the deed, which you may have heard, was actually coined long before international terrorism hit our television screens and our front page newspapers. It was in fact born out of the anarchist movement in the late 19th century in Europe as a strategy for individual and collective action. But today's terrorist landscape throws up some new challenges. But it also doesn't differ too significantly from past waves of terrorism. And terrorists, as I often say, are opportunists, not innovators. Today, Australia boasts one of the broadest ranging and most comprehensive suite of terrorism and terrorism-related laws of any other Western nation, despite the fact that we have not had a mass casualty attack on our soil. Provisions in our criminal codes cover terrorist acts as well as activities that may be associated with those acts, and as such cover a broad range of activities, including the commission of a terrorist act, planning or financing an act, providing or receiving training, possessing things connected with terrorist acts, which today could be a mobile phone, collecting or making documents likely to facilitate terrorist acts, membership, recruitment, financing, providing support or training with a listed terrorist organisation, urging violence or advocating terrorism, entering, preparing to enter, or recruiting persons to enter a foreign country with the intention of engaging, thank you very much, in hostile activity. The provision also covers intention to commit an offence or reckless actions that would amount to an offence. Quite a list there, but all of this is designed and implemented in response to an interpretation of the contemporary threat of terrorism. But the question that I want to ask tonight, and maybe answer, we'll see, is what does that contemporary terrorist threat actually look like? And when we look at that threat in a little more detail, is our response the right response? How are we going with that? So, today's terrorism landscape is characterised by lone actors with loose or no affiliations to organised groups, a focus on radicalisation to an ideology or cause, the threat posed by returned foreign fighters, low-tech attacks with little or no coordination and planning, and the use of information and communication technologies. So I want to tackle, not all of them because we only have half an hour, but I'll tackle some of them and get into a bit of an exploration with you about the nature of those threats and some of the research that I did that throws up some questions about our response to those threats. So I want to start with lone actors, because we talk a lot about this spike in lone actors, also called, as you'll see in the newspapers, lone wolves. I want to start by dispelling some myths around this lone wolf phenomenon that has yielded a number of theoretical and research-based studies offering typologies of lone actors. Firstly, I want to emphasise that there is no such thing as a single profile of a violent extremist actor. And indeed, attempts to create typologies or profiles of terrorist actors based on demographic characteristics such as age, gender, race and ethnicity are not only of limited use, they are actually also counterproductive. Good example of that in 1972. While Israeli airport security were focused on the possibility of a Palestinian attack, they were looking for those brown people. 3 members of the Japanese Red Army attacked Lod Airport, killing 26 and injuring 80. Demonstrating the futility of developing terrorist profiles or typologies of would-be actors based on these kinds of broad demographic traits. And throughout various iterations of terrorist waves, the anarchist wave, the new left wave, the post-colonial wave, the religious wave, the demographic characteristics of actors remains generally unchanged. They tend to be blokes. Sorry, men. Aged about anywhere between 18 and 40, and rather unextraordinary in every other facet. Yet, several attempts have been made to identify individuals who are vulnerable to radicalisation by profiling, resulting in a securitisation of entire communities and actually having a counterproductive impact on prevention and the countering of violent extremism and terrorism. And this brings me to radicalisation, this kind of umbrella term that's used to describe a process by which an individual or a group progresses from radical or extremist thought through to violent action. Now, radicalisation is used as a basis for the development of threat assessment, but also for the development of our legislative response. And it's often presumed to be a predictor of violence. And it's used in models that inform countering violent extremism policy and programs. Conflating. What that does is conflates a tendency towards or support for violence as a legitimate avenue for collective action with radicalisation. This kind of conflation fails to distinguish between 2 kinds of radicalisation, which I'll talk about in a minute: cognitive radicalisation and behavioural radicalisation, and assumes that radicalisation can predict violent behaviour. Okay. The response is that many de-radicalisation programs therefore fail also to distinguish between de-radicalisation and disengagement. An example, many Jamaat Islamiyah members who have undergone, maybe they heard me say Jamaat Islamiyah because I said it right. Not Jamaat Islamiyah. Many Jamaat Islamiyah members who have undergone de-radicalisation remain dedicated to the objectives of JI even after they've abandoned violence in pursuit of these objectives. So, while some scholars have argued that radicalisation cannot be appropriately deconstructed in terms of a kind of a fixed series of stages, including myself, others contend that radicalisation is a fairly ordered path, with terrorism as the ultimate manifestation of radicalisation. And so what you have is any attempt to understand radicalisation as a process where you have somebody rather unextraordinary progress through all of these stages, with the final stage being activator, where they commit an actual act of terrorism. Where they try and understand radicalisation as this process, the response then is usually also based on this rather false understanding of radicalization as being a process that can be stopped at a certain point. And so what we have as a result of that is checklists, little checklists of radicalization and vulnerability to radicalization, often consisting of some rather arbitrary characteristics or behaviours and used to target individuals. One of those examples is what's more commonly known as the NYPD model. It's the Silver and Bart model, and it was used by the NYPD in profiling would-be terrorists and in their measures, law enforcement measures in the US. So according to this model, radicalization is segmented along 4 phases. Okay, first phase number 1 is actually the pre-radicalization phase. So pre-radicalization is a phase of radicalization. Who knew? The pre-radicalization phase, otherwise referred to as the point of origin, is the period of time at the start of the radicalization process that describes individuals prior to being exposed to Islam. The self-identification phase is the next phase, and that is when an individual is exposed to internal and external triggers, which may include trauma, social alienation, economic marginalization, or discrimination. Those triggers cause the individual to commence a search for ontological security, which may include making drastic changes to their lives. Sounds a bit like menopause. Where they reinterpret their faith, find new meaning in their lives, and associate with different yet like-minded people, adopting new religious ideologies as their own. The born-again phase, yeah? The next phase is the indoctrination phase, when individuals will increasingly intensify their belief system to the point that they wholeheartedly adopt these ideologies and the worldview and conditions and circumstances, whereby action is justified to support and further the cause. And the final phase is the jihadization phase, which occurs when members of a select group usually appoint themselves as warriors in a holy war and thus see it as a religious duty to begin planning, preparing, and undertaking a terrorist attack. Perhaps the most problematic part of this model is that the pre-radicalization phase is described as the point of origin of individuals who are unremarkable, with ordinary jobs, ordinary lives, and with minor, if any, criminal history. In essence then, the pre-radicalization phase describes any average person prior to the adoption of radical Islamic views. But radicalization, we know, does not necessarily lead to violent extremism, and conversely, violent extremism is not necessarily an outcome of radicalization. There are, this is where I want to talk about those two distinctions, the distinction between cognitive and behavioural radicalization. So cognitive radicalization is the personalization and internalization of a set of beliefs associated with a radical or extremist ideology, right? People can be cognitively radicalized and never, ever, ever adopt violence. Behavioural radicalization is the acceptance of and willingness to use violence as a necessary means in relation to beliefs and ideology. Again, people can adopt violence and never, ever, ever be cognitively radicalized. The two don't necessarily lead to each other, and they're not necessarily interrelated. But here's the thing, there's a third consideration. And that third consideration is that if an individual is both cognitively and behaviourally radicalized, they must also be presented with or seek out opportunity. An opportunity to use violence for the intention of carrying out their beliefs or their ideology through violent means. Now, when we look at radicalization through the framework of cognitive, behavioural and opportunity, we can begin to develop a more useful typology of lone actors. And there are several typologies that are out there. I won't go through all of them, but I do want to point out a few of them. One of them is Jessica Stern's lone avenger, who are individuals who are only loosely affiliated to any ideology, commit acts of violence as expressions of personal vendettas. Feldman distinguishes between terrorists who seek an ex post facto justification for their violent actions and those who progress through what he calls a terrorist cycle. One of the most useful typologies I've found for right-wing neo-Nazi actors is Wilhelm's typology that distinguishes between right-wing activists who are ideologically driven, ethnocentric youth who are driven by perceived grievances, and criminal youth who have marked right-wing ideological leanings. And he says this about criminal youth. He says, criminal youth, in terms of the propensity to violence, there is a markedly action-oriented, aggressive and violently disposed type. Here, violence is not seen as a means of political conflict, but as a normal element of daily life and conflict resolution which needs no specific legitimation. So it's safe to say, then, that much of our efforts in countering and preventing violent extremism and terrorism have focused exclusively on the cognitive radicalisation, those people with the funny ideas. And in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks, programs focused on social cohesion, integration, moderating ideologies, civic values, while legislation and security focused on removing or reducing opportunity for carrying out attacks, either through law enforcement or through target hardening. But what about behavioural radicalisation and the propensity to violence, as described by Wilhelm? Have we missed a critical component of the equation that could potentially offer a more useful way of profiling behavioural characteristics and identifying individuals? We know, for example, that the Sydney siege perpetrator had a history of violence. The Burke Street attacker had a criminal history. The Christchurch terrorist actor posed his manifesto, which justifies the use of violence, before he carried out his attack. The attacker who ploughed a van into pedestrians in Toronto in 2018, killing 10 people, was revealed to be part of an alarming incel subculture. He openly declared his will to carry out an attack as a salute to Elliot Rodger, who was the perpetrator of the Isla Vista shooting and driving attack in 2014. And the list goes on. There's something here that we're missing about a propensity to violence among terrorist actors. And these are questions that I asked when I embarked on a research project that looked at 100 case studies of Western-born self-activators, otherwise lone actors. I prefer to call them self-activators, individuals who either carried out an attack, were arrested in connection with planning an attack, or travelled overseas as a foreign fighter. That research sought to identify patterns and characteristics of pathways to violence, with the presumption that individual propensity to violence is a key personal trait that influence individual trajectories to violence. And the findings of this distinguish between three different types of actors, right? So type 1s were cognitively and behaviourally radicalised. They drank the Kool-Aid, became violent within the context of radicalisation. So in other words, they adopted an ideology and then accepted that in order to further that ideology, they had to commit an act of violence. Violence was the only way. And I've met many former terrorists who tell me that they joined terrorist organisations because they believed that violence was the only option. Type 2 were less cognitively radicalised, though they were likely to inhabit the motifs and symbols of ideology. They were attracted to the violent elements of the ideology, and that attraction drove their actions, as well as their adoption of the ideology. In other words, they had an inherent attraction to the violence and therefore adopted the ideology in order to justify their violence. of their need for violence or their attraction to that violence. And type 3 were what I call the rapid escalators, rapid escalation to violence, or REV, R-E-V, REV, rapid, okay. And they exhibit high trait aggression. They applied ideology to their act of violence and not their entire worldview, and often had ex post facto declaration of ideology. So these are people who were going to commit a violent act anyway, and then committed the violent act and saw a justification for it through the ideology post the act. So this question of propensity to violence, behavioural radicalisation, cognitive radicalisation extends also to the issue of returning foreign fighters. And what I found with my research when comparing foreign fighters to domestic terrorist actors was that domestic actors were more likely to be type 1 or type 3. In other words, they were more likely to be fully drank the Kool-Aid, or I'm going to do something anyway, and then I'm going to say that it was, you know, Allah has a snack bar as I'm doing it. Somebody got the joke, and it wasn't my son. Who else? You got it? Good. Okay. So, domestic actors, type 1 or type 3. But foreign fighters, more likely to be type 2. Less cognitively radicalised and primarily mobilised by an attraction to violence, which actually is in line with and in accordance with a lot of other research that shows that young men who went off to fight for in Syria for ISIS carried with them copies of Jihad for Dummies. There are some important insights here that should inform our response to the contemporary challenges of domestic terrorism, rising white supremacist violent extremism, and returning foreign fighters. In the first sitting of the 46th Parliament in August this year, the Parliament passed a bill that would effectively prevent Australian foreign jihadists from re-entering Australia for 2 years, the Temporary Exclusion Orders Bill. That bill attempts to deal with the assumption that those returning from theatres of conflict in Iraq and Syria are both cognitively and behaviourally radicalised and therefore present a risk to Australia. Here's some information for you about returning foreign fighters. The first successful attack by a returnee in Europe occurred in 2014 with the shooting at the Brussels Jewish Museum. Since then, there have been several other attacks by returnees in Europe, culminating in the coordinated attacks in Paris in 2015 and Brussels in 2016. Studies of past waves of returning foreign fighters demonstrate that veteran fighters can play a critical role in inspiring, influencing and advocating for the perpetuation of violent movements, often from within their jail cells. But those studies don't take into account that past returning foreign fighters fought with a much more ideologically driven movement of Al-Qaeda than the more violent-driven movement of ISIS, and doesn't take into account the new crop of ISIS recruits being more behaviourally radicalised and less cognitively radicalised. A study of returnees in Belgium, Germany and the Netherlands, which was published by Egmont last year, raises some interesting points. In these countries, returnees are generally detained, so they let them in, they don't have temporary exclusion orders, they're retained until trial. In prison, they're subjected to various regimes to monitor and manage their conditions. Then once they're released, they become part of various programs. Some programs are more intrusive than others. But among the key findings of the study, some are really worth mentioning here. And the first one is that the study found that the most seasoned fighters will no longer return to their countries of origin. The most seasoned fighters continue to follow the next theatre of jihad. They become professional foreign fighters. And indeed, many of the fighters who first started with ISIS had come from previous wars and previous theatres of jihad. There is a migratory nature to foreign fighters. Most recent returnees are likely to be women and children. And prior to the 2014 attacks in Brussels, returnees were not systematically prosecuted in Europe. The legislative changes in the criminal codes of those three countries that I mentioned earlier, Belgium, Germany and the Netherlands, changes to the criminal codes in these countries have been broadened, and returnees across Europe now, including women, are starting to be systematically prosecuted. In the past, women and children in particular, but women in particular, were never prosecuted. This is a recent phenomenon in Europe, and a recent phenomenon that is a response to the 2014 attack by returnees. Most interesting, beyond the judicial response, all three countries developed a range of measures and mechanisms to deal with returnees, leading to comprehensive multi-agency approaches involving a broad range of actors and services. Now, there are lessons for us to learn here if we are open to learning them. That's a big if with the current government, let me just say. The first is that the judicial response is not enough. Not enough to prevent would-be foreign fighters from leaving Australia for Syria without any programs to redirect them to positive, non-violent resolutions to conflict. And I said this when we first introduced this legislation of stopping people from travelling to Syria. I did a lot of work with young people who were prevented from going to Syria because there was nothing for them. They were prevented from going to Syria, and there were no other options given to them to redirect their path of violence to a more positive path. And just to give you one anecdote, I got a call from a lawyer who was representing two young boys who were stopped from travelling to Syria. They'd been expelled from school or suspended from school, and so had to do directed to do all their schooling on their internet. The internet is what got them into trouble in the first place. But they were stopped from going to school, redirected to all their work on the internet, with no thinking about this is how they got involved in these negative thoughts and negative beliefs and negative actions in the first place. So if we've learned anything from almost 2 decades of the so-called war on terror, it's that we cannot defeat terrorism with military action alone. We cannot arrest our way out of this, and we certainly cannot ignore new forms and developing iterations of the terrorist threat because they come from those who look like us. And I'm talking specifically here about rising right-wing and white supremacist threats of terrorism, which are an increasingly growing concern. But I'm going to, I think I've taken up most or all of my time, and I can just finish off then with the internet, because that presents some specific challenges, and I think specific challenges also to the legislative regime, and particularly in the balancing of civil liberties and concerns with the need to deal with the tide of terrorism and terrorists using the internet in different ways. Now, most of the emphasis is looking at how terrorists use encryption services and encrypted messaging to coordinate attacks using the internet. Their activities on the dark web. I did a show for Channel 7 a couple of weeks ago looking at online gaming chat rooms and how they're being used to recruit white supremacists through My Little Pony, believe it or not. So My Little Pony has an actual chat room that is a neo-Nazi My Little Pony. It is really freaky. Like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want to talk a little bit about this. We all have this increasingly reliance on social media for everything from news to entertainment to social connectedness. it's no surprise that terrorism has also moved to using social media for those things as well. Another research study that I've done and that I've spoken about a lot and talked about a lot is looking at social media profiles, because guess what? We're always surprised when after an attack we find out that they actually said on Facebook that they were going to carry out an attack. We shouldn't be surprised. It's actually very, very common. And the first time this kind of came to my attention was when I was in Washington and I got a phone call from a family whose son had travelled to Syria to fight with ISIS. And when I looked at his name, I thought, I know that name. And so I went back to all the Facebook and social media research that I had done. And sure enough, there he was 6 months earlier saying he was going to go over to fight. So I want to talk about a different way that we should be looking also at that nexus between technology and terrorism. I'm just going to try and find my spot here. Hang on. I never write down my speeches, but I've taken to writing them down, and I tell you what, it's not really that good. It's better just to talk, isn't it? Okay, here we go. There's an increasing awareness of terrorist use of social media and measures to mitigate the continued threat. Terrorists and criminal groups are now migrating to the dark web and using encryption services, which I've spoken about. The dark web allows criminals and terrorists to operate in this haven of obscurity. But they've long been using the dark web in much the same way as they've been using the surface web as a kind of thing to recruit, radicalise, influence, finance and coordinate attacks. That's what terrorists use the internet for. Since 2015, there's been a significant increase in the use of Telegram, which is an encrypted instant messaging platform by terrorist actors. And according to the International Centre for Counter-Terrorism, in March 2016, there were 700 new Telegram channels opened in 1 month alone that identified with ISIS in a single month. In 2017, we saw the crackdown on popular dark web markets, Alphaba and Hansa. It sounds like characters out of a Star Trek movie. This follows the takedown of the Silk Road in 2013, another operation in 2014 that seized around half a dozen darknet sites. But each time, the darknet has bounced back. The latest crackdown drove cyber criminals to migrate to messaging apps like Telegram, WhatsApp, and Facebook Messenger, things that we use in our everyday. And they're being used to trade stolen credit cards, account information, malware, and drugs. They're using the same apps that millions of people use to communicate every day. And more importantly, these apps don't require any specialist skills or knowledge. Even a boomer could use them. They are accessible to anybody with a phone and can be used with relative ease. So what we're seeing is more coordinated integration of cybercrime and terrorism. And in January 2015, evidence emerged of a terror cell that used Bitcoin to fundraise for operations. In another example, an Indonesian-based group collected Bitcoin donations on the dark web, and then using a stolen identity from the dark web, hacked a trading website. They managed to collect $600,000 US using a series of cyber crimes. Now, in the past, cyber terrorism has been this kind of elusive thing to define, and we haven't really had a concept and no agreement on what cyber terrorism is. There were theories around what a cyber terrorism attack might look like, what it would entail. It was generally accepted that cyber terrorism would involve the use of computers or technology to create a disruption to critical infrastructure, in other words, take down eyes and ears, and then cause death or the spreading of fear. So in other words, terrorism carried out by technology. The interface of cybercrime and terrorism, the use of cyber capabilities, not as weapons of attack, but as enablers of terrorism through cyber criminal activities, I think, is a much more tangible way of conceptualizing what cyber terrorism looks like today and what it would look like in the future. And a much more tangible way of defining the problem so that we can then start looking at what are the legislative measures and what are the solutions that we need in order to address that problem. So, in closing, it's my experience, it is in my experience, difficult to predict how and when the next threat to our national security will emerge. The best that we can do is to be prepared. The best that we can do is to be vigilant. And governments have for many years now continued to play catch up. And we still do. We still play catch up with terrorists and criminal organisations. Shutting down one avenue, hardening another target, introducing yet another piece of legislation. But we are always behind because we are always responding. So while our law enforcement agencies, I think, do a pretty good job of keeping Australians safe, their task is even more complex with the introduction of novel modes of terror and crime. We need to develop capabilities and capacity to stay ahead of trends. But we also need to be willing and able to understand that our success in combating terrorism cannot be limited to military conquests in foreign countries. Our success in combating terrorism cannot be limited to furthering and broadening our legislative regime. Terrorism and the threat of terrorism cannot be measured against our gains in battlefields in countries far away.